In 1921, the United States destroyed the wealthiest black community ever built on American soil and spent 99 years insisting the mass graves did not exist. In 2020, they were found in a Tulsa cemetery. What the city had buried began surfacing with them. This is Black Wall Street, the day the National Guard turned aircraft on Greenwood, destroyed 35 blocks, and killed between 100 and 300 people, a number never officially counted. And what the DNA from those graves is pointing to explains why this country was so afraid of what they had built. To understand why the DNA findings hit so hard, you need to understand what Greenwood actually was. Not the version that gets 2 sentences in a textbook. The real one. In 1906, a lawyer and educator named O.W. Gurley purchased 40 acres of land in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and decided he would sell that land only to black Americans. What grew on those 40 acres over the next 15 years had no precedent in this country's history. By 1921, a black dentist in Greenwood drove one of the finest cars in Tulsa. His white patients crossed the color line to see him because he was the best dentist in the city. He parked outside his own building, on his own street, in a neighborhood that the surrounding white community had decided should not exist. That dentist was one of more than 600 black business owners on a single stretch of road that residents called Black Wall Street. Greenwood had its own hospital, its own law firms, its own newspaper, its own hotels. The dollar circulated within the community an estimated 19 times before leaving it. In a typical American neighborhood today, the dollar circulates once or twice. Greenwood built, in 15 years, on land nobody else wanted, an economic ecosystem that did not need the white financial infrastructure surrounding it to function. That is what the aircraft flew over on the morning of June 1st, 1921. If this kind of buried history matters to you, leave a like right now. It costs nothing, and it helps this reach the people who need to hear it. On the evening of May 31st, 1921, a 19-year-old black shoe shiner named Dick Rowland rode an elevator in a downtown Tulsa building. The elevator operator, a 17-year-old white woman named Sarah Page, cried out. Rowland ran. Nobody has ever established what actually happened in that elevator. What happened next had nothing to do with what happened in that elevator. By the following morning, the Tulsa Tribune had run a front-page story under the headline that called for a lynching. A white mob gathered outside the courthouse where Rowland was being held. Black veterans of the First World War, men who had fought in the trenches of France under a flag that classified them as inferior, arrived armed to prevent it. Shots were fired in the street. What followed was not a riot. Riots are spontaneous. What followed was organized. The Tulsa Police Department issued weapons to members of the white mob and formally deputized them. The Oklahoma National Guard arrived and began detaining black residents, not the armed men who had started shooting, but the black residents trying to protect their neighborhood. Private aircraft flew over Greenwood. Eyewitnesses reported gunfire from the planes. By dawn on June 1st, 35 city blocks had been reduced to rubble and ash. Between 100 and 300 people were dead. The American Red Cross estimated that 10,000 people had been made homeless overnight. More than 800 black residents were hospitalized. Property damage was estimated at $1.8 million in 1921 values. Not one person was ever convicted of any crime connected to any of it. Then came the burial, not of the bodies, of the truth. Insurance companies invoked riot clauses and denied every claim. The city condemned the remaining Greenwood property and attempted to rezone it for industrial use, which would have made rebuilding legally impossible. Local newspapers stopped covering the story. State officials ordered records sealed. The Tulsa Tribune removed its own front-page story from its bound archive volumes. Survivors rebuilt Greenwood anyway, without compensation, without legal recourse, and for decades, without anyone outside of Tulsa knowing what had happened to them. The massacre was not taught in Oklahoma schools. It did not appear in state historical records. It was not in the national textbooks. An entire generation of Americans grew up without knowing that the United States government had turned military resources against the most prosperous black community in the country's history. and then systematically remove the evidence. When survivors described mass graves, investigators found nothing. When journalists looked for records, the records were not there. When lawyers pushed for accountability, every door was closed. The graves were the last piece of evidence. And for 99 years, the city of Tulsa looked anyone who asked in the eye and said there was nothing there. Drop a comment right now. Had you heard of Black Wall Street before today? Because what comes next is the part that even the official investigations were not fully prepared for. In 2019, the city of Tulsa commissioned a formal search for mass grave sites associated with the massacre. Ground-penetrating radar surveys identified anomalies at Oaklawn Cemetery, consistent with a trench burial pattern that did not match standard cemetery records from the same period. The city announced the findings, then waited 11 months before beginning excavations. That delay became its own story. City officials cited funding issues and logistical complications. When one member of the mayor's commission pushed publicly for the excavations to begin, she was removed from the commission. The city did not explain why. Descendants of massacre survivors did not need an explanation. The city had spent 99 years saying there was nothing there. Finding something would mean the city had been wrong for 99 years. And everyone involved understood what that meant. In October of 2020, archaeologists finally opened the ground at Oaklawn. Within the first week, they uncovered a trench containing at least 36 sets of skeletal remains. No markers, no coffins in most cases, no documentation in the cemetery's own records. The burial pattern was inconsistent with standard practice at Oaklawn during any period. It was consistent with mass internment under time pressure. The city of Tulsa had insisted for 99 years that no such graves existed. 36 sets of remains said otherwise. DNA extraction began in 2022 in partnership with Intermountain Forensics and the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification, two of the most respected forensic laboratories in the country. The goal was identification. The goal was names. What the DNA also produced was something the research team had not included in their original project design. The Oaklawn remains showed genetic profiles clustering strongly around Senegambian and West Central African lineages. The Wolof, the Mandinka, the Bakongo, consistent with what population genetics research has established as the dominant ancestral sources for Black Americans in the Midwest and the South. That was expected. What was not expected was what happened when the team ran those profiles against a database of modern Black American families in the Tulsa area, specifically families whose documented genealogies could be traced to Greenwood before 1921. Geneticists measure relatedness through segments of DNA that are identical by descent, stretches of genetic code that two people share because they inherited them from the same ancestor. The longer those shared segments, the more recent the common ancestor. What the Oaklawn comparison produced were shared segments that were too long, too specific, and appearing at too many positions to be explained by the general West African ancestry that both groups carried. These were not the signatures of populations that happened to come from the same continent. These were the signatures of families. Approximately 31% of the Tulsa area family profiles showed at least one significant matching segment with the Oaklawn remains. In a population of this size, random overlap would predict less than 4%. The team ran the comparison 3 times using different statistical models. Each time, the number held. 31% is not noise. That is not general population similarity. That is families. Read that again. The families were still there, in the same city, some of them living within blocks of where their great-grandparents had been buried in an unmarked trench. And the DNA connecting them to those graves had been sitting in both places the entire time, while the city spent 99 years telling them there was nothing to find. One family representative described the moment she received the call from the forensic team. She had been submitting DNA samples for years. When the match came back, she said her family had always known, that they had told people for decades, that the city had told them they were wrong. The science told them they were right. That is not a small thing. That is 100 years of official denial overturned by a genomic comparison that took 3 weeks to run. Now, here's the question the DNA is forcing this country to answer. The Wolof people of Senegambia built the Jolof Empire, a federated state that resisted Portuguese slaving operations through organized military and diplomatic resistance for more than a century. When slavers arrived on the Senegambian coast in the 1400s, the Wolof did not collapse. They negotiated. They fought. They maintained enough political coherence to limit what the Portuguese could take for generations. The Mandinka were the people of the Mali Empire. At its height, the Mali Empire controlled more gold than any other political entity on Earth. Its scholars traveled to universities in Cairo and Timbuktu. Its traders maintained networks from the Sahara to the Atlantic. These were not people without traditions of administration, commerce, and resistance. They had built one of the greatest examples of all three in human history. The Bakongo maintained a functioning kingdom with ambassadors in European courts for 200 years after first contact with Portuguese slavers. Their descendants arrived in North America in chains. They rebuilt in Greenwood. In 15 years, without access to the banking system, without legal protection, they produced 600 businesses and a hospital and a law district and a newspaper and a dollar that circulated 19 times. The aircraft flew over that on the morning of June 1st, 1921. The DNA in those graves at Oak Lawn carries the same haplogroup signatures that appear in Black American ancestry research across the country. Wolof lineages, Mandinka markers, Bakongo distributions. These were not exceptional people from exceptional places. They were the same community that existed in Black neighborhoods across America, carrying the same inherited traditions of building and resisting and refusing to disappear. What made Greenwood exceptional was not some separate quality its people possessed. It was the 15 years they had been left alone long enough to show what those traditions could produce at scale. That is what the aircraft destroyed. That is what the DNA remembers. The identification work at Oak Lawn is ongoing. A second potential gravesite near New Block Park is under evaluation. More names are coming back from the laboratory. In 2021, the Oklahoma Supreme Court ruled that a lawsuit brought by massacre survivors and their descendants could proceed under the state's public nuisance statute. The legal argument was specific. The massacre created a harm that had never been remediated, a harm that was not historical, but present. The families carrying the DNA that matched those graves were living with the consequences of 1921 every day of their lives. The science became part of the legal record. The case is still working through the courts. The ground at Oak Lawn still has more to say, but here is what the record already shows. Greenwood was built on land nobody wanted, by people the law said were worth less, using traditions that crossed the Atlantic in chains. It was destroyed in 16 hours. The evidence was buried. The survivors were told they were wrong. The records were sealed. The graves were denied. For 99 years, the city of Tulsa maintained that story. Then a forensic team opened a trench, ran a comparison, and the DNA connected the living to the dead with a precision that no official denial could match. The ground remembered what the city tried to bury. Somewhere in Tulsa right now, a family is waiting for a call from a laboratory. They submitted their DNA months ago. They have been told the process takes time. They already know, the way families know things that official records refuse to confirm, that someone they lost is in that ground. The science is just catching up to what they have carried for 100 years. When the call comes, it will not fix anything. It will not return the hospital, or the newspaper, or the 600 businesses, or the 19 times circulating dollar. It will not give back the century of a city telling them they were wrong. But it will do the one thing that 99 years of official denial could not prevent. It will say the name. If this history matters to you, subscribe and drop a comment telling me which part hit you hardest. The identification work is still running. The connections are still being made. And every time the science comes back, the story gets truer than anything this country ever put in a textbook.